Brian, we'll turn this over to you for our annual Bagley-Keene open closed meetings training.
All right.
Okay.
Whoop, whoop.
This is exciting stuff. I'm actually very pleased to talk to you about this because we've been through this over a number of years. And I remember when I first started working for you, I went over and visited with another pension system, and I sat in the back of the room, and I happened to be sitting near the press table. I had no idea, I'd never been there. And so something came out on the agenda, and one of the press people said to the other, "Wow, that was really fast. They seem to have reached a consensus before they came out and covered the item." And the other person said, "Not like CalSTRS, where they go through everything in excruciating detail." And I thought, I'm really proud to be working for this pension system. So you've always had a dedication to transparency. We've covered Bagley-Keene over the years. We've had, we've had various presentations, but we've also had some issues. There are sometimes when it seems like an ill-fitting suit of clothes, and that's kind of where I wanted to spend some time on. It's a principles-based statutory scheme. The first principle is that all of the proceedings of a public agency or a state body must be open. I like to talk about the opening and closing sections of the statute. The opening section of the statute, section 11120, says, "It is the intent of the law that actions of state agencies be taken openly and that their deliberation be conducted openly." And then the very last section is 11132 and says, "Except as expressly authorized in this article, no closed session may be held by any state body." So you start off with the principle that all meetings are open. There are some narrow exceptions for closed session, and those are the only items that can not be discussed in public. And as I said, sometimes we've had some pain points. The underlying principle, obviously, to allow the public to participate, and that means having advance notice, being able to review the materials, see the materials that you have, and also full access, including ADA access. So, meeting is defined as any congregation of a majority of the members, and I have in there in brackets of the board, but really the phrase used is a state body. And that becomes important in just a moment when we talk about what constitutes a meeting. At the same time and place to hear, discuss, or deliberate upon any item that's within the subject matter jurisdiction of the board. The subject matter jurisdiction of the board is another important concept in this statutory scheme. So what is a state body? State body is where this is where you come up with the rule, what I call the pesky rule of three, the one that sometimes feels a little bit difficult to navigate through. Under 11121C, a committee or subcommittee is considered the same as a state body. So if you have a standing committee or subcommittee, that has the same requirements as a state body. There's also a catch-all if there is a if it's created by the board, or if it's a committee that consists of 3 members, 3 or more members. So that's a state body. All the rules apply to those state bodies. So the same rule that applies to the full board applies to committees of the board, and would apply to 3 persons, a congregation of 3 persons, to discuss items that are the subject matter of the board. These rules add on to when it talks about congregation in the same place at the same time. Then, of course, there, with technology and other ways of communication, the statute's been amended and made clear that there are that serial communications or electronic communications, anything that allows a board to reach consensus in private, could violate Bagley-Keene. Again, it's, if you have a majority of a state body, it's, what's prohibited is communications, again, which discuss, deliberate, or about taking action on any item of business which is in the subject matter of the board. Unfortunately, Bagley-Keene at times is not, the statute isn't as clear as you'd like. It doesn't make a distinction between the subject matter of a board and the subject matter of a committee. So while it talks about different types of state bodies, it doesn't, it never changes, the text never changes, the language never changes, and it's always the subject matter of the board. So if you have an appeals committee group of three, even if the appeals committee group is talking about investments, it's still the subject matter of the board. Bagley-Keene does not make any distinction on the subject matter of the committee. All meetings are open and all persons are allowed to attend. So there can be no restrictions on folks attending meetings, including requiring identification. Meetings include getting together for informal study, informational, or fact-finding. I know that's come up over the years. Several board members have wanted to get together and delve deeply into an issue. Unfortunately, if it's in the subject matter board, or fortunately for public participation, that does constitute a meeting. Some of these quotes that you'll see on slide 8 are from Attorney General's opinions interpreting Bagley-Keene. Actually, from a court opinion. And it is only by embracing the collective inquiry and discussion stages, as well as the ultimate step of official action, can an open meeting regulation frustrate evasive devices. And that's when they were faced with an argument that, well, the board was just getting information, was just fact gathering, and was not actually making a decision. That the restriction is much broader than that. Of course, there are exclusions, speaking about with staff about items that are within the subject matter or with a member of the public. Again, there's no serial communication allowed, passing that on, getting a consensus. Conferences or seminars that involve issues of general interest and providing information to members of the legislature. I mentioned committees. There's a note in here about the appeals committee. This is really about ex parte communication. You are faced, I think, as a board, you have delegated your appeals decision-making to the appeals committee. The appeals committee sits as a trier of fact, similar to a judge. So there cannot be any communication with a judge outside of the proceeding. So when you get communication from a member or someone else regarding a case or matter in controversy, I think if you do get that, we ask you to disregard it, or forward it to staff to respond to, because both sides of a case should have an equal opportunity to respond. Comes up occasionally, and hopefully we get out the advice that you need to, but certainly continue to send those, if you get those communications, continue to send them to the Assistant General Counsel, Raina Manoy, who represents the system in those cases. Advance notice, you're very good about this. Time clearly stated. One of the things that often comes up for us is when's the end time, when's the start time. You've been very good about that, saying we're going to resume, these times are estimate. So the place of the meeting. So there is an opportunity to have meetings via teleconference or technology, but there are rules regarding the locations that are used. So for each location, some of the same rules apply. There has to be identified in the notice or agenda ahead of time. The agenda has to be posted at the location. Each location has to be accessible to the public, and that includes ADA accessibility. It has to be accessible to the point that a member of the public can also comment on the items that are being broadcast. And at least one member of the state body should be present at each physical location. At the end of that section, there is, and this is another instance where Bagley-Keene is the clarity is less than optimal. It provides for additional locations for public participation. But it's a location, and then you go back to the same rules about locations, and each location has to be accessible to the public, it has to be agendized, it has to have prior notice. And that, again, reading that in totality means you can have another teleconference, a location where a board member is not present, but it has to follow all the same rules. Part of the, we talk about the notice, and I talked about sort of the having full knowledge of what's going to be discussed. Bagley-Keene talks about sort of 20 words or less. It really is it sufficient notice? Does somebody know what's going to be talked about? And then items on the agenda. If it's on the agenda, you can discuss it. If it's not, you cannot. You can add as information items. There are very few exceptions for that, which I'll briefly mention, but basically your agenda controls your discussions. See, I have the documents. The documents, we have traditionally done a very good job of providing documents. We provide them on the website, which is not necessary to provide them ahead of time, but we do. We provide them in the public if there's available, and then if there's anything new, we provide that. So I'd like to spend just a minute on public comment. So Government Code Section 1125.7 talks about members of the public have an opportunity to address the body on each agenda item. And it is items that are for discussion or consideration of the committee. I mean, of the state body. So it's an unfettered access of the public to discuss items. There is an opportunity, a provision in Bagley-Keene where it says the state body, in this case this board, could adopt reasonable regulations to limit the total amount of time allotted for public discussion or for each individual speaker. So it is possible for the board to adopt regulations to control public comment. Without such a regulation, you cannot require people not to comment or impose restrictions on those comments. At least, and you can make suggestions, which you have. You have a policy for this. But you can't strictly enforce it. If someone wants to speak for 5 minutes under the law, they're entitled to speak for 5 minutes. So that the law does recognize that you can pass regulation, but absent that, there is no restriction in Bagley-Keene on public comment. Just not that it's ever come up here, but just thought I'd add that there is a provision in Bagley-Keene if for some reason speakers or members of the public become so disruptive that you can't continue the business of the board, you can recess the board and have the room cleared and not resume until peace is restored. Don't think that's going to happen with our folks, but I thought I would at least mention that. For those of you who think things might get out of hand. So we talked about basically it's access, it's meaningful access. Can you see the documents? Can you participate? Can you ask questions? Can you get into the meeting? Can you hear what's being said? Can you see what's being said? There are other meetings. There's a special meeting, it's called at the discretion of the chair, requires 48 hours notice. But there are very limited circumstances: pending litigation, proposed legislation, or disciplinary action. There are, there are emergency meetings, but they normally would not apply to us. So let's talk about closed sessions. Again, the basic principle, of course, is that every meeting is open and the public is entitled to participate. Bagley-Keene makes very narrow exceptions, and they're specifically laid out in the code. I'm just going to talk about some of the ones that you normally deal with. Investment decisions. So this is in subsection 16 of 11126. We have looked at this. The investment decision is not limited to a specific investment. In the Brown Act, which applies to local agencies, there is a requirement that investment decisions be limited to a specific investment. CalSTRS actually lobbied for that language to be different in Bagley-Keene and was successful. So it's a broader, it's a broader interpretation than a specific investment. Litigation. So litigation is defined in 11126 subparagraph E. It's a detailed analysis. I think the important thing for the board to remember is that this is the only expression of attorney-client privilege in Bagley-Keene. In other words, there are no other opportunities to confer in private with your attorney unless it's regarding litigation. And then the attorney-client privilege does not apply in that closed session. It's the Bagley-Keene closed session privilege. Common used exceptions we have for personnel matters, and then there's a specific provision where you can discuss the CEO. I call it the JACK provision. You have deliberation on decisions and appeals, that's specifically called out. And then information security, there's a section that talks about whether there's a threat or potential threat against information or electronic data. The notice of closed session is similar. It is a description of the subject matter or the statutory authority providing you with the cases and information about the cases. As I said, the attorney-client privilege does not apply. However, any legal opinions or legal documents that are sent to you under attorney-client privilege, that privilege is maintained. And then, of course, as you well know, following a closed session, you reconvene an open session and you announce if there was any action taken. General principles, all meetings are open with limited specific exception, and the purpose of Bagley-Keene is to provide the public with a meaningful opportunity to participate in the public's business. And then a way I would approach at least an overall view of closed session is that it's limited circumstances where the public interest may be balanced against the duty to protect privacy, respond to litigation in a manner that best protects the interest of the public. In other words, doesn't prejudice your interests and the interest of the fund. For example, talking about your litigation strategy in open session. And responsibly invest public money. Again, it's the same. Will you be at a disadvantage if you discuss it in public? A very quick trip through slides and Bagley-Keene. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Brian. Very helpful. So, you know, you mentioned about the investment discussion didn't have to be limited to a specific investment decision, but you didn't sort of say, well, where is the dividing line? What is the dividing line between what can we discuss in closed session on investments and what can we not discuss in closed session on investments? If the dividing line isn't a specific investment, there must be some point of demarcation. Could you describe that?
I can, except I first have to answer that. I'd have to say that it's not perfectly clear what that demarcation line is. And I would reference a confidential memo I had sent previously interpreting this statute, but I think really it is the principle that we just talked about, and that's what's in the legislative history, is whether the discussion of the investment matter would be a detriment to the fund. And so broader discussions, strategic discussions or tactical discussions that if it were to be announced in public would somehow disadvantage the fund. That's at least what the commentators were trying to get to when they differentiated between what was happening in the Brown Act and what was happening in Bagley-Keene. It's more of an art than a science. It is, I'm not an investment professional, I'd like to give you some examples, but it is if let's say you want to discuss moving into a particular space, a particular investment space, and a certain amount, you want to move some money into that space and you want people to explore the opportunity to potentially make an investment decision. And somehow or another, the board, in consultation with its experts, feels that if it were to telegraph that interest, that it would somehow or another change the pricing or in any other way disadvantage CalSTRS in the marketplace, that would probably come within the investment decision exception. But that's just a hypothetical, so it is something that would require analysis, and that's part of what we do when we prepare the agenda. That's one of the questions I ask as things are being prepared, so that is part of the input that I give, is whether or not it is something that should be in closed session.
So given your example,
Okay, I might be.
well, no, I mean, the example, the issue that I think we have to wrestle with is on the one hand, we want to go into closed session when it's important for the protection of the fund as allowed under Bagley-Keene. But on the other hand, we don't want closed session to become something that then hampers us from talking about anything in open session. So my question is, if we were to talk about investing in a strategy in closed session, would that mean that we could never have any conversation in open session about that strategy?
Well, so the investment decision exception right now, as it's written, allows for a closed session discussion of an investment decision, but provides for for disclosure to the public after the decision and the investment is made. So the statute,
I'm not talking about
the
a
statute itself
decision.
recognizes
I'm
the
not talking
public's
about a
right to know.
decision. I'm talking about a discussion about a pop. In other words, I think that I would say that the challenge that I find isn't what we talk about in closed session. It's because we talk about so many things in closed session that have to do with investment strategy. Theoretically, that could then mean that we can't talk about anything in open session because we talk about all these things in closed session. And I'm trying to understand, in other words, if we get an update on how our private equity portfolio is doing or our global equity portfolio is doing in closed session, does that prevent us then from talking about our global equity portfolio in open session?
Right. Again, I would look at the specific instances. I would look at, there are some parallels. If you look at, there's a Travis case and another case that talked about frameworks. So, for example, their discussion of making a personnel decision is authorized as a closed session item. So there were a series of discussions in closed session to set up the criteria for establishing that or for doing that performance evaluation. So a member of the public sued and said, well, the discussion of the framework is not the decision. And the court said, no, that's not correct because you can't make the decision without the framework. And so having a discussion, a series of discussions to establish the framework to do the analysis to make the decision was an acceptable closed session under the Brown Act, which you can use to interpret Bagley-Keene. So I would look at it that way. I would look at it, are we discussing, if we're not discussing an investment decision, are we discussing a framework that's necessary to make an investment decision? And then if any of that framework, if it was disclosed to the world, would act as a financial detriment to the system, then that would be another part of your analysis. So there is no bright line test, but there are parameters to enter into the analysis. And so, part of my job is to look at those issues, and when the agenda is produced, very often that's part of the commentary or comments and discussions I have with the investment staff and with Jack on agenda items. So it's an excellent question, but there are no real bright line answers. It is, again, I think that would inform the decision-making process.
Paul, let me go to Irena, because I think she can help.
Well, I just want to, on this point, Brian, is it your understanding that the closed session then creates a privilege for the board for that issue that's being discussed? So that then if the board wanted to have that conversation in an open session that same day or at a different time, if the board wanted to talk about it in public, the board would be within its rights to release that privilege and have the conversation in open session, right? There wouldn't be anything prohibiting that.
The Bagley-Keene provision for closed session is a permissive statute. In other words, it says everything has to be open, but you are permitted to put these things into closed session.
But what I'm saying is, if Paul is, what Paul is raising the issue is, once we have it in this privileged context in closed, that is there a concern that we can't then have it in open? But I think the answer is no, because it's the board's, once it's been, once it's clear that it's appropriate to be discussed in closed session, right? That's governed by Bagley-Keene. Right. But if the board decides that the need for confidentiality no longer exists, then the board I don't see any reason why the board can't then say, yes, we had this privileged conversation about it, but now we're going to talk about it because the concern, the whatever that justified the Bagley-Keene exclusion is now gone, and you can talk about it. It doesn't cement it as a closed-only discussion.
That's correct. There are two analogies or two pieces of information that can help draw that conclusion. One is, again, going back to the investment decision section, it says that the board can then announce that decision at such time after it was made that it will no longer work a detriment to the system. So first of all, the statute recognizes at some point it's no longer something that has to be kept privileged. The other is the attorney-client privilege. If you look at the attorney-client privilege, it is the holder of the privilege that can waive the privilege. So if it is the board that has the privilege, so the board in its entirety could waive the privilege.
So that would be in the context of not an investment issue, but perhaps legal strategy or legal advice about a
right, but it could also be in the context of the board deciding to do something in open session, even though there may be some argument to do it in closed session. So the answer to your question, original question, is yes, that is, but that would be a board decision, not an individual board member decision.
Right.
Does that help you, Paul?
That would, but we're only talking about investments. We're not talking about the considerations in other sections. In other words, privacy, employment matters, evaluation. So for example, in the employment matter, if you're going to take a personnel action, if you're actually going to deliberate on it, it's up to the employee to decide whether they want to have that done in public. So there are other rules, but we're talking about the investment exception.
Paul?
My only question is the board never really makes these decisions. I mean, we don't sit either in open session or closed session and decide we're going to have a conversation in open session or closed session. That's usually the chair of the board or the chair of the committee and you, I assume. So, you know, does a topic being put on the agenda on the open session, does that constitute releasing the confidentiality discussion if that same issue had been discussed in closed session? I'm not sure how the board makes that decision, because we don't. We've never, in the 6 years I've been on this board, I've never had a decision come to the board as to whether to have a conversation in open session or closed session.
Well, you could, actually, I've seen a couple instances where the board has said, very often with my advice, whether or not this is something that's appropriate for closed session, and then decided that it should be an open session. And have also made a converse decision where this is not something that we should discuss in open session. It should be discussed in closed session. So I have seen those decisions made. One of which was in a litigation matter, which is a separate exception that you can include a litigation matter that was not on the agenda if it meets the appropriate level of urgency. So I have seen you make the decisions, but like a lot of other agenda control, it really does come down to the chair of the committee working with the staff, or the chair of the board working with staff. And if there are items that are identified for closed session or for open session, there should be an ability to get the advice that you need or get the decisions that you made. I certainly, that's a major part of my job.
I guess what I'm asking is as an individual board member, then we're just supposed to use our best judgment that if a topic was discussed in closed session, but now that same subject matter, let's just use global equity as an example, is now discussed in open session, that we should just use our own best judgment to make sure that we're
You're editing your comments from.
editing the comments to be consistent with the nature of the closed session discussion? Is that the way it should work?
That is the way it should work.
So it's up
And
to us each individually then to make that judgment.
on that particular instance, yeah, because
thank
it's the same, I know, you get closed session reports and you get open session reports from the same people about the same subject. And sometimes it is very difficult to keep those two separate. So for example, the evaluation of some of your investment managers, you get into some detail in your closed
I think
session
that's a
and
pretty
it's
easy
open.
one, but I think
Yeah, but
sometimes there are
I was
other
going for an easy
questions.
example, but yeah, you're right. It is what is presented to the board or the committee in closed session that's for closed session. And then it certainly is the responsibility of the board member to maintain that confidentiality. But that would be, the individual board member would obviously have some judgment in that. Like, should I bring that up? We just talked about it, but certainly. Hopefully, I mean, that's,
You help us with that, right? You provide guidance.
that's part of my role here, so yeah.
So, Paul, do you have a specific concern?
Yeah, that was just that. It was if we have a closed session, I think it's become more difficult for us because we have closed session now before open session.
Those are difficult circumstances.
So it was always clear that what questions we could ask that the questions we asked in open session weren't constrained by the conversation that happened in closed session. But now what happens is, because we have closed session first, sometimes I get confused as to whether we can have a conversation in open session about an issue, or whether I'm crossing some line because we've had that conversation in closed session. And I don't want to raise my hand and say, wait a second, let's go into closed session and decide whether I can ask that question. So I think it's up to each one of us to have to do that. But the reality is, you know, when you impose a question of, does it hurt the the system, well, I mean, there's no black and white answer on that one either, right?
Actually, there's not, but I
So,
would like to.
so that's the question that I have, and
So-
it's been an issue that's been raised in my mind because we've switched the order of closed and open session.
So, if we had a conversation, say we're talking, because we're talking about investments, we're talking about a specific investment, we're in closed session, we
That's
make a
clear.
decision.
I don't have a question about that one.
So then I don't,
A question.
so give me a specific example and let's see if we can figure out how to do it.
We have semi-annual performance reports.
Okay.
And we discuss them in closed session, we discuss them in open sessions. So a question comes up in closed session. And there's an answer to it. And then we go into open session, and there's a conversation in open session that sparks a thought that related to something that was discussed in closed session. Can we raise that? Can we pursue that?
So at that point, I think we can raise the question. It's whether that question gets answered in open session or not gets to be made, and that's what we count on Brian for. So if Brian thinks that the possible answer to that question could be detrimental to the system, then he would have to let us know,
I would recommend you go into closed session.
to even ask if,
Right, like.
I mean,
you
it
would
could be
then
a question, it
recommend.
could be a comment.
well, the comment, yes, but I mean, so Brian, weigh in on that.
First thing I'd like to say is, I absolutely agree with Paul. That creates a very uncomfortable situation. We had that not too many months ago, and ever since that meeting, I have really stressed not to do that again. Not to be topsy-turvy like that, because it does raise issues, and it makes it very difficult for board members to figure out where their comments are appropriate. And it is also difficult if you're getting to a situation and you all have ideas, you've all prepared for the meeting, and the first opportunity you get to speak about is in closed session. You have open and closed thoughts about the item. It's much easier if you do it in open session first, and you have your open session thoughts, you have your general thoughts about it, and then you go into closed session where you have reserved those thoughts for the different details that are being presented. So I absolutely agree that it presents a problem. I've seen it happen, and ever since it's happened, I have been a strong voice, as well as others on the executive staff and chairs of committees to see that we don't get into that situation again. At least a situation where we do a similar item in closed session and then discuss it in open session. That is because that self-editing is a very, very tough thing to do. And yes, I'm here to assist, of course, but we really do try to get it right so we don't put you in that position again.
So then one of the things that we could do, if we find ourselves, so like when we do our quarterly reports and things like that, then to mitigate the possibility of that happening, couldn't we always have our open session first and then follow with our closed session?
I think that's
So that's part scheduling on
That's
that?
best advice. If you have to turn it the other way, then at least recognize that this is an issue and, help assist board members to work through it.
Harry?
So that's the fourth time that Dana articulated the exact thought that I was having, like in 2 days, like this is
I like it when I
kind of
challenge
dangerous. I
Harry.
mean, this is really kind of this is a little too, if it goes to 5, I don't know, Dana.
We go out and get lottery
We may have to change
tickets.
the nature of the entire relationship, I don't know. But maybe that's the simple solution, is that to have the norm, don't say we're gonna do this all the time, but the norm will be, we have closed session at the end, and we do open session first. And as the draft agenda for the November investment committee currently has closed session at the end of the agenda. So maybe that's the simple solution. There might be exceptions where we want to deal with a investment committee in closed session at the start of the day, but that would be the exception. And essentially, I think, Paul, that might be the simple solution. So why don't,
No problem.
Why don't we do that? Why don't we just do
Let's
that?
do
And work with Chris and the team and Tom and as restructuring, knowing that we need
Yeah.
some flexibility, but, this potentially is we'll get, it will help Paul a lot and help others. So why don't we just do that?
And then Climate Advisory just seems like that's the one.
So that might be the solution.
So I was actually going to say, we could always do the board closed session first tomorrow morning, and then people wouldn't have to be here so bright and early, but guess what, guys, that ain't happening. We'll go with our open session first.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Brian, do you have anything else for us on that?
No, thank you so much. Thank you for your attention and interest in the subject.
Thank you. We appreciate it. All righty. Jack, how do you want to handle this? Are we just going to ask questions or?
Yeah, just got a little bit of setup and, it's like what Chris did yesterday in the investment branch report. We'll just call this up and all the executive staff are here. I want to make sure for Karen as our new board member, you haven't done this before, where we kind of looked over the enterprise business plans. I want to make sure you kind of see how we set this up with you and how we talk about it throughout the year. It isn't just today with you, but this is what we call the strategy map. And really, these last 2 weeks and then next week, Cassandra and I will be going to all of our member service centers and presenting town halls with all of our employees. And we're using this strategy map to, again, focus all of our staff to make sure that all the activities we do in this organization of any priority fit through these quadrants. And so it is an important iconic representation for us of the strategic plan, with the upper right being our member employer services and all the things that we do in that area, the upper left being the actuarial and investment issues, the lower left being our large enterprise business transformation technology projects like Pension Solution, and then on the bottom right, the things we're doing around succession, leadership development, all of our human resource activity. So for us, that's the lens that we look at all that we do here. And that's the scary part that fits through that lens. Just kind of visually, we've mapped for you all those initiatives that go on in this organization, so you can kind of see the volume. And, over the years we've done this with you, we've gotten a lot of feedback to get narrower focus, not so many priorities, not so much strain on resources, but even with that momentum in that direction, it's still an awful lot that we're doing. This is the sequence, though, that I want to make sure everyone kind of remembers how we do this together. You put together a 3-year strategic plan. The third year is 18-19. That doesn't mean you can't change it and play with it, obviously, in that period, but that's the 3-year period we're working in with specific objectives and specific measures that were developed in that strategic plan. Then each year, at this time, we put together an operational business plan together for you. And the purpose of this is more to give meat to that through the initiatives and the activities. And between doing this and then the tail end, when we see you a year from now and give you the progress report, there's 2 things going on. One, Chris Ailman and I are doing mid-year assessments with our chairs and vice chairs, doing a check-in on the progress of these activities. But more importantly, internally in the organization, every 3 months, the executive staff really goes through this business plan activity by activity by activity, rating each one, whether we're moving at the proper pace or whether we're falling behind, or whether something has to be rethought in a different direction. So I want to make sure there's a lot of hands-on to this plan. This isn't just the document for July this month, but we really work it then throughout the year so that every single person on the executive staff, no matter what branch they're working on, shares ownership of the entire strategy map and not just their branch responsibilities. And then this year it'll be September. We'll provide for you just a summary and roadmap of the accomplishments that are on these various activities and initiatives for a year. So that's the sequence of how it all fits together. And we certainly have evolved that over time, but this seems to be working pretty well, I think, right now. And then what I was going to do is just real quickly, given the time, I thought we picked out a couple initiatives for you just to make sure you know, it's a lot to read and some of it may seem in the weeds to you, but there are a few on here that are pretty significant that we'll be working on during the coming year that really do need your attention as well. One is the comments we've already talked about is really forming this new body within the organization, marrying our actuarial and financial and investment group together into an ALL team. So they will be, they've started to be formed, and that activity is starting throughout the year of really looking at that asset and liability management piece together. So that's exciting for all of us, something we haven't done really in any meaningful way before. So that's one very important piece of this business plan for the year. And then this is one you talked about yesterday with Chris, specifically around the investment plan, to look at alternative ways of managing our investments. We've all heard about Canada too much, so it's time to kind of see specifically whether there's opportunities there for CalSTRS or not in the investment strategy. So those are the two I picked out that are clearly moving the organization to some newer directions off the actuarial and the investment side of that goal. And then here we have now switching over to the member employer side of things. And, you know, it's been a big accomplishment getting the build out of all of our regional centers. And for now, we're done. We don't have plans for any more cities or any more large footprints. The only one we didn't really move to that we had first thought we would was Fresno. That still sits out there as an idea, but it doesn't seem to have the economics of it to make that a good financial decision for the organization. So finishing that physical footprint has been a big 5-year effort for the organization. So now it's kind of time to, we'll look back, and this is with Andrew and Sandy Blair, you know, in terms of our retirement readiness staff, to go back and look at some of the rural areas. Dana knows that so well in the Northern California side. This isn't all about now the anchor stores, but now we've got to figure out whether we need to readjust some of the tentacles as they fit into the rural education of our members. You heard a little bit from Krista about how we want to now look at how technology can help us deliver some of that communication with our members. And most definitely, it's time to relook at how we use the staffing around the P2 program, both being more holistic in the presentation of our benefit programs here, and hopefully being a little more direct with the membership around the P2 offerings. So Sandy's spending a lot of time on her staffing pattern. She's got a few very key vacancies to fill in the coming weeks, and we'll probably by the time we see you again in the offsite, we'll have made some hiring decisions in there that will really be solidifying the staffing pattern. It'll be real important for the membership. And then, you know, you've heard us talk about this as an internal strategy. You know, every business today, major business, talks about how to onboard your employees and whether they do it well. It's become a term of art in terms of new employee orientation. And we want to take the thinking we've done with that and the structure and kind of now start thinking about relative to teachers, having that same kind of aggressive, structured onboarding process. And how can we get in that work stream with new teachers? So again, that's an exciting opportunity for us we haven't done, and Andrew and Sandy's area particularly will be tackling that as one of their initiatives in the coming year. Then on the transformation side, this needs little explanation since we have standing board items dedicated to this. Tomorrow morning, we'll have a fairly complete, comprehensive discussion around this, the project and where we stand, especially relative to rollout number 1 and how that may impact the success of rollouts. This certainly has all of our attention as our top internal priority in the organization. But a part we don't talk a lot yet with you about is the companion piece to this, and that is, apart from getting the project done and all the demands of getting it right, is aligning the organization in a new way. So we are certainly expecting to be doing some reorganization of CalSTRS and how we deliver our services to the members and how the workflow works within the organization. So we've got a team around this initiative working on change management strategies, but also organizational design that is the companion piece to the actual technology project. So that's going to gain more importance now that we're getting to the production line in what we do. And then finally, on the human resource side, you as a board, in fact, at the September offsite, Amy's helping with a session with you and an outside speaker around succession planning and then some innovative ideas around the CEO and the CIO. But we also have a parallel set of activity going on within the organization around our senior management position. So that's in the works for this year. And then finally, I wanted to highlight, you've all been interested, I've really appreciated your interest. I often find boards don't have as much internal focus as you do around internal leadership development, but I think you've been very good about recognizing the time we've spent with developing our future leaders of the organization and making sure we don't get caught short by the baby boom retirement wave in the organization. And you've seen these last years, hiring after hiring of senior positions that's come out of that leadership development program. Chris Ailman and his senior staff and investments have been working with our human resource staff now to develop a parallel program specifically on the investment branch. And Chris debuted that and announced that to his staff in an all-staff meeting recently. And since we've had a good track record with this in the whole organization, I think this is something his staff seems very receptive to, and so we'll report back on that to you at the end of the year. So that's a big human resource piece for us on the internal side to work on the investment branch. So those are just kind of a quick highlight of the things I identified in the business plan that obviously need all of our attention at the highest level. Was there anything that caught your attention that you kind of looked at when you looked at that you'd like anyone to respond to or talk about?
Harry?
Yeah.
Maybe a little more on the onboarding of the member engagement slide, Jack.
Yeah, and Andrew, I'll let you come up, and if you want to do that piece. Every one of these has an executive that's the champion to that initiative, and you comfortable doing that? Yes. All right.
Welcome back.
Is the objective or the goal to actually have the newer members of CalSTRS, the newer educators, more engaged with CalSTRS earlier on?
Yes, so the thinking behind the framework for onboarding new members is really to connect with members early in their career. So what we are thinking about and some of the things that we've initially done is reach out to organizations, for example, BITSA, to try and create relationships so that we can get CalSTRS information into the hands of members and the people who influence new members. I will say that has been challenging. BITSA has a lot of activities that they're already charged with doing. And so there's been kind of some heavy lifting with that particular organization, but that's sort of just the initial foray into those kinds of activities. And we have a number of other avenues that we will continue to pursue along that same vein.
Yeah, it's an important initiative. I just think there's yeah, I mean, it's teachers in general, right? People who go into education in general, right? I normally don't like to speak in generalities, but for the purpose of making a point, a couple of things that they don't think a lot about. One is they go into teaching because they think about others and they're trying to make a change in the world. They're not thinking about themselves, right? Generally speaking, they're givers, not takers. So we have to have that mindset, right? These are people who aren't thinking like, I'm climbing this ladder and I'm going to compile big stacks of cash, right? So money and self are not really, and that's why I like so it's just having that awareness so that when we try to engage, it's like other organizations that are looking to engage with new teachers and educators. if we talk to them about things that happened in the 1980s and the movement that some of us are, impressed by and moved by, doesn't mean anything to them. But if we talk to them about their professional growth, empowering them, respecting them, engaging them in curriculum conversations about how we're going to close the achievement gap. Wow, yeah. So it's just a food for thought, because I think we do have to capture them earlier, because by it's knowledge is power, and knowledge about your retirement. And if someone makes teaching their career, if they make it their career, it's probably the most valuable asset they'll ever have, is their defined benefit pension. And if they can learn to invest a little bit along the way, they'll retire with security. So it's links to what we're trying to do. So it's really, really important. My point is how we talk to them, how we try to engage them, the language we use. I know you all know this, but I just wanted to make that point. And I think partnering with the right organizations too, and I would just leave this out there for thought, is perhaps it's also, people think about closing the achievement gap. They talk about high school, they did all that, and they realize, wait a second, if we invested in early childhood education, you get the greatest bang for, you got to get the kids early. And then others said, no, you've got to get to the parents and teach the parents that reading to your child is the most important thing you can do from the womb to birth and then on, exposing them to the language. All this money you're throwing at high schools, it's hard to get here. Maybe we need to get into the schools of education, where the pipeline of future educators are coming. And how do we engage with the UC systems and the private colleges, where a lot of public education teachers will be coming from, and speak to them about CalSTRS, and how do we get penetration in those schools, because we get them actually before they become teachers.
And we are having those conversations. So thank you. And the challenge is going to be making the connections and kind of getting movement. I think, though, that you're absolutely right. Identifying the key organizations is the first important step, and we are on that path.
All right. Anything else, Harry?
No.
All right. Andrew, this probably would have worked really well in Chris's presentation too, but I had my note here. I belong to several organizations that I get text messages from. And one of the things that we didn't talk about was texting. So Human Rights Campaign, if you think about the political campaigns last fall, there's a plethora of ways or places you can join that shoot you messages on a regular basis. It's all voluntary. So let's think about actually maybe using that, because I think Harry's right in his comments earlier. Our technology is going to grow smaller. And God knows what I'd do if I ever misplace my phone, because we're attached at the hip. So I think that's going to be the route that we're going. And I'm glad that we're talking about a mobile app and those types of things, but let's not forget about texting. I had a couple other comments, if you don't mind. Jack, within the write-up, when we're talking about 403B, we're talking about trying to get districts to put some sort of a badge on their websites. How about if we reached out to the constituency groups and also asked them if they would be willing to put something on their badges? We know that we've got local union chapters that are on their websites that are very concerned about who enters into their schools and who's selling product to their members. So we might be able to reach out not only to state, local, but smaller geographic areas that have websites for their union members. We might be able to get a badge on those sites too. Many locals have their own websites. Yeah, so we go, so you can go state. There's smaller geographic areas also, Uniserves, things like that, and then also locals. So that's might be another place where we can reach out. And
More for the 403B compare.
For 403B compare, yeah.
For, not the pension two piece, but yeah.
No, the 403B compare.
I was trying to get to your, now I got it.
Yeah. It might be a little bit harder to, you know how hard that would be, yes.
Yeah, it's a delicate thing there.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I got it.
But the 403B, I think that's,
Yeah. I don't
think
know that
that's
we've pushed the
important.
badge in that
Yeah.
point, yeah.
If we're asking the districts to put it on, let's also ask,
Okay.
some more people.
Got it.
And then I want to make sure that when we're talking about diversity and inclusion, we're also talking about LGBTQ plus community and making sure that we're doing whatever we can to do education and training and things like that.
All right.
Alrighty, thank you.
Yep.
Karen?
Jack, thanks for explaining the strategic plan and the business plan but are these goals that you have outlined, like for 17, 18, these are the things that are on your to-do list? On this,
The goals are across all 3 years.
right?
They're not specific
okay.
to 1 year at all, but they're over the 3-year period. And then specific to today, or the year, the 12 months that are really the initiatives and the activities that will support those ultimate objectives and goals.
Okay,
So those change year to year. Some of them are multi-year too. I shouldn't make it so
okay.
distinct. But we're kind of focusing on is the activity that's going to happen in the organization to support the overall structure.
Okay, so I guess, on like TRB 45 then, so that's goal number 3, business transformation. And then under initiative 3, where it says, you've completed your long-term facility planning, right? Those are all checked off. Do you see that? It's on second column.
Well, the initiative is complete long-term facilities planning. The completed activities are the ones that are grayed out and checked off.
Yeah, those are
Last
checked
year.
off.
Right,
Those
but
are done.
We still have key activities that support that
Right.
complete long-term facility planning.
Okay, and then so the key activities for 17, 18, that means these are on your to-do list?
Yes.
Okay, okay.
Big
So
to-do
then
list,
can you
yeah.
talk a little bit more about that to-do list?
Absolutely. Yeah, well, Lisa, do that then if you want to. Yeah, absolutely. Which page you on? Yeah, page 14. Got it.
So what we're doing with the long-term planning initiative right now is finishing up our optimization effort that we had talked with the board about last fall, I believe, is when we did that. And so basically what we're doing is we're implementing some strategies to optimize the space in the current facility to last us until 2019. And so at the same time, the board's given us direction to start looking at long-term planning alternatives. One of those alternatives is to actually hire a construction manager as well as an architect and a general contractor to begin looking at what a second tower may look like, the design of the second tower, as well as, and really the purpose of that is to come back to you in the fall of 2019 with that as an alternative, and we need to know what the budget would be for that. At the same time, we'll be looking at other alternatives, like perhaps retrofitting a building, an existing building that we can retrofit to meet our needs, or leasing space elsewhere. So those are the activities that we're working on for this fiscal year.
We have each of the floors in this building tagged by their level of opportunity left for spacing. Some of the floors, I think we had 6 floors tagged as in the red zone, meaning they're almost basically full. And you heard Chris Ailman speak yesterday to the board, basically saying, I got nothing left here in 2 years. Same goes for actually Brian's area right now. Totally, there is absolutely no room in the building for any additional attorneys unless we move someone else out of an office or something. So there are hot spots in the building already, even before we get to that long-term facility plan. We may have to come back to you for some midterm strategy, even to make it to the finish line on the long-term piece of it. It's gotten so tight in some areas. So we are very concerned.
Anything further, Karen? Right. Anybody else? All right, Jack, I have to say, every time we read the business plan and we see everything that's been checked off, you guys do an amazing job of getting a tremendous amount of work done. So kudos to you, your staff, the building, everybody here. It's absolutely fabulous. So thank you very much. All right, it is 10 after 5. We did decide that we wanted to go a full 3 days, and, oh, Dave, go ahead.
I'd like to, I'm Dave Davini, retired school administrator. I'd like to comment on goal 2 to enhance services for members and employers. I'd like to see some thought given to a key activity in that area related to retired members and related to enhancing or looking at services to retired members. As an organization, if you look at the membership in the organization, it's approaching almost one-on-one, for there's one retired member for every active member. We need to have some sort of key activity which makes sure we're made whole or kept current in the activities of the organization. I think it's important that we at least look at what is a key activity for the retired member group and what services should we be providing and enhancing in that area.
Dave, do you have any suggestions? I'd love to hear more about that, actually. Does anything?
I'm just reading this. I haven't had a chance really to.
No, but I mean, as a retiree, do you have any reflections of how we could serve you better?
Well, I think we have some needs. We just came out with a study in the benefits and services that said 10,000 of our members are not or could be at a poverty level. That seems to me that we ought to address that as an organization, we ought to be looking at the needs of those members. We've heard year after year the need to look at the possibility of increasing the death benefit. We have other needs as retirees that as an organization, we ought to have a mechanism to look at those needs and to address them. Certainly, I think if you ask a large number of retired members what they wish would happen, you could certainly compile a list of areas where we have needs and where we have concerns. And so I'd just like you to consider that. And maybe before the November adoption of the budget or the November adoption of priorities, that we give that some thought and that we address it.
Alrighty. So we decided we were going to go 3 days. We have more stuff to come tomorrow. We're going to end it for today and have a lovely evening, and we will start bright and early again tomorrow morning. And it feels really good not to go late today. So we stand recessed. Yay, it's recess! Start today's meeting with the items that we originally had scheduled to begin with this morning. So we will start with items 15, 16, and then we will go back to the agenda and the items that we did not finish yesterday. So we would then start with 9, and without objection from the board, I think that's how we'll proceed. All righty, that sounds good. So, Ashish, Andrew, you guys ready? Yes. I should have given you more heads up than I did. I apologize. But I knew you guys would be ready anyhow. I knew you'd be ready anyhow. And while Ashish and Andrew are getting settled, I just want to let the board know that when we do return to our consent agenda, there was a new board member education page. So I think there were some changes there that came out between the time our packets came out. And so when we go to move those, you have those at your seats. All righty.
Okay.
Good morning.
I was hoping that we start 9:30. So we have we have few folks lined up in outside. So we just text them. So probably they will come here soon. I just want to recognize the Team CGI executive leadership is here. Our project management senior leadership is here. So I will introduce to them.
Ashish, if they're not in the room now, we can go back to Robin, if Robin's ready.
Yeah.
If you were expecting us to go back to our regular meeting, we're good with that, I'm fine. I just
Okay.
wanted to do that while we were really, really fresh.
Yeah, I think because they, they were supposed to be here, and I mentioned 9:30 to them.
Okay,
so
let's,
that's-
let's go back to, we'll go back to our original plan then.
Okay,
Alrighty.
thanks. Thank you so much.
Robin, sorry. We're not gonna change it, our consultants, we're expecting 9:30 and I changed the game plan on them, so. Thank you, Robin.
No problem. Good morning. So we ended yesterday with the review of the business plan for FY 17-18. And so I want to reference you back to the budget at the very end of the business plan, which is on TRB 50 and 51. So that's our budget for FY 17-18. And that is supporting the business plan initiatives and objectives and activities. And so what we're doing with you now is talking about how we want to move forward for next fiscal year. This is a time of year when I deal with 3 different years. We're finishing up 16-17 from a financial reporting perspective. We're entering the budget year that you see in your business plan for 17-18, and then we're beginning our planning process for fiscal year 18-19. We're early this year. Typically, this is something we do in September, but given our change in schedule, we wanted to make sure we were able to bring you our ideas in terms of changes for the fiscal year 18-19 budget before we actually formally present it to you in November. So that's really the purpose of this item. Because of the timing, the estimates are at a higher level than they might have been in prior years. But we hope we've captured the major components of what we're looking for next year. So I want to start out by, again, linking this back to the strategic plan. And talk about the fact that we've got strategic priorities in financial service and operations areas. Again, as we talked about, as Chris did his long-term investment planning, our focus in the financial area is on the transition to internal management for investments. So included in this fiscal year 18-19 budget are concepts related to a longer-term planning opportunity for bringing staff on board to support additional internal management. On the service side, you'll see we're focused on deploying the resources that we acquired last year in the BCP around retirement readiness. And then on the operations area, again, we're focused on deploying the resources we got in a BCP for 17-18 around risk, compliance, and security. And we're moving forward with our pension solution project, which supports both the service and operations strategic priorities. So again, focused against that strategic plan and the objectives of the organization. So what our fiscal year 18-19 budget asks for is in all a fairly low change to the budget, but it's comprised of 2 offsetting, one decrease and one increase. The decrease is that the amount of money in this fiscal year that was included in our budget change proposal for the pension solution project is less than it was last year. So you see a reduction there. And then on the investments side, we're asking for an increase of 12 staff and the associated costs related to that. And so overall, the budget doesn't shift very much, but it does have those 2 offsetting pieces. So this next slide goes through the increase piece. We're asking for, after having had discussions with the Department of Finance, we're asking for your response to a concept where we have a 5-year budget change proposal. So we would put together, based on Chris's long-term plan for the investment portfolio and the transition from external to internal management, this would be the operational budget increase for those 5 years in terms of bringing staff into the organization and transitioning out external fees. So although this is a cost-saving BCP overall, because we're reducing the external fees, from a budgetary perspective, it looks solely like an increase because the other portion is continuously appropriated. There is no legislative impact on that. It is a reduction in those external fees. In addition to investment staff that are aligned to manage the portfolio and to support risk management and research, we also have included in this 2 additional attorneys to support the validation and monitoring of contracts associated with that activity. So that's also here. We have laid this out with our, and it's really a level allocation of the resources, but what we've worked out, we think with finance is that we would have this estimate of deployment, but you would have the authority during the 5-year period to time those resources. So we would be coming back to you at least once a year saying, for the following fiscal year, we would like to use X percentage of this, or allow for the incorporation of these 3 additional positions. We might also do that mid-year, should there be market opportunities that investments wants to take advantage of and they need to deploy more resources internally to do that. That really is the benefit of this concept, is that you would have the authority to take from the total and allocate that at different points in time. In terms of the overall change to the budget, again, we have this addition in salaries and benefits related to the investment and legal staff, and then we have the merit increases that were a part of the bargaining agreements that the state of California entered into this past bargaining event. We have that shift down in the pension solution budget. We have a pro rata increase, and most of this we're expecting is in the healthcare coverage for retirees. And then we have a small adjustment to deal with the fact that as we hire new people in other areas, we also provide additional resources to our human resources area to support that staff in a way that will allow them to be engaged. And with that, I'm prepared to discuss any of these concepts or any questions that you might have within the write-up. A lot of information on how that work was actually going to settle down to know what our resource needs were going to be. And because we have authorization to reappropriate certain surpluses in our budget, we felt that that gave us enough contingency in the year 18-19. Happy to take.
If anyone has any questions of Robin, just dial in. Uh-oh.
Todd.
All right. Robin, we're going to take a 5-minute break and see what we got going on with the system. And if we don't, we'll come back and we'll do paper and pen. All righty, 5-minute break, guys.